spreadsheets were a really great tool for a really long time, but have they had their day in the sun? Because honestly, it's 2026 and there are still so many businesses that have this situation where they've got this huge spreadsheet that forms this really important part of their operations. And I want to talk about the problems with it, and I want to talk about what the solution looks like in 2026, because things have changed a lot even in the last 12 months. And this is now a vastly inferior solution to what you're actually able to come up with. So let's just talk about this hypothetical company for a second, Meridian Mechanical Services. So they have 150 technicians that go out across various cities in the United States and do mechanical work on their HVAC systems, so air conditioning, ventilation, heating systems. And this spreadsheet, right, is a list of all of those technicians and a list of all the different credentials and certifications that they have, because the customers that these technicians go into might be hospitals or government buildings. Those customers require that these mechanics have the required credentials. So this tracks kind of like all these different, jargon sounding credentials that different technicians have and their expiry dates. And the problem with the spreadsheet is that this is the source of truth in the company for what technicians have what credentials. But it's really important that the right technicians do in fact have the right credentials, because otherwise they could get turned away at the door. They could lose big contracts, lose trust with some of these big customers. And right now you have multiple people within the company who are using this spreadsheet. So you have the dispatchers themselves. These are the people who sort of coordinate the logistics of sending out technicians to different sites. So they're going to consult the spreadsheet on a particular day to figure out, hey, which technician has what credentials? And depending on those credentials and their validity, right, they can send them out to different sites, right? You could exchange this for kind of any kind of ERP style resource that you're managing, right? The point is that this is a data store for the status, essentially, of certain resources and whether they should be deployed out into some environment. And the problem with this is that this spreadsheet doesn't actually capture some of the core business logic, which is actually these customers that exist, like, for example, UC Med. What credentials does UC Med actually require? Yes, there's a badge that they need to have, but are there also other credentials that are required? So that information doesn't live in the spreadsheet. That lives in some other place that the dispatchers are managing. They're just referencing the spreadsheet at the time that they dispatch somebody. And so they're basically reading data from the spreadsheet. Then you also have HR people who are writing data into the spreadsheet. So they're updating these credentials and their expiry dates. They're chasing technicians when their credentials are due to expire. And that exposes obviously another problem with the spreadsheet, which is that these credentials expire, but there's no sort of smart logic to notify anybody when that's going to happen. And then you have the core operational staff. There's usually somebody like this in the business. We're going to call this person Karen, who just has this wealth of knowledge. She's worked at the company for 19 years. She knows all the customers. She knows the way that processes have evolved. And a lot of the information is in her head. And she's sort of managing, what if there's a new credential that might be required, she might be adding that column. At some point, somebody was intelligent enough or had the foresight to add another list here of some of the other sort of structured data that we're storing, like different union classifications that some of these technicians have, which is important metadata for HR. But it's still pretty, it's pretty bare bones. This is a system that could very easily break. All somebody has to do is sort a column at the same time as somebody else is making it, copy paste. And then all of a sudden some data has gone into the wrong row, right? There's essentially the spreadsheet's being corrupted, and then you have to go back and you have to see the revision history and you have to fix things, right? This happens, right? We see this sort of stuff firsthand. And it's why, this spreadsheet is not the most optimal solution. The problem is that spreadsheets are so flexible that they tend to fill these gaps in your operations where no other tool really can, right? And getting off of them has been quite hard traditionally. You have these no-code tools that, for the better part of the last decade have come into play, tools like Notion or Coda or Airtable, which are, take kind of some of the basic premise of spreadsheets, but extend them and allow you to add other features on top, like automations, connect via API to other services. But they're still not super flexible. They still can get complex kind of fast. You kind of need an expert in-house to be able to manage them. But the biggest problem is that they're just not as flexible and custom as you might want. So you do spend a lot of time working around the constraints of the tool. That is also the problem with some of the off-the-shelf tools. Like, not to mention, of course, that these are often, because they're pretty targeting a particular industry vertical, they're usually quite expensive and get away with charging high prices. But they're also restrict you, right? So you end up kind of bending your workflow to fit within the constraints of this existing tool, rather than having something that sort of fits like a glove over the way that your unique business actually needs to work. The optimal solution then is actually, let's just build something totally custom. Historically, that's been a problem, because historically custom software takes months and months to build. It costs, at a minimum, tens of thousands of dollars, depending on how the complexity can go. Obviously, it can go way up into hundreds of thousands of dollars as well. Now, so this is the best solution. It's just been historically a little hard to get into. That's all changed more or less within the last 12 months due to these developments in AI applied to development, applied to coding, which has made the actual development process a lot quicker. And so custom software is now within reach. And I would argue that the cost of switching to a new tool, to a custom built tool, it pales in comparison to the benefits of switching to a new tool that can then start to expand and really become this operational hub for, not even a single department, but maybe across departments in your business. So where do you start from here, right? So okay, you recognize that yes, using this, getting off the spreadsheet is a business priority. This is something that makes sense due to, the ease at which we can now develop custom software. So the first thing is to just figure out the answers to a few key questions, which you can more or less infer based on the spreadsheet that you're using, but also, of course, just the operational processes that you're familiar with. So, of course, what roles need to actually access the app? So in our case, right, that we talked about, sort of the main people who are accessing this are the dispatchers themselves, HR department, and sort of operational hub, who you can see as the super admin, who's a very important role, might I add, that we will talk more about. So who needs to actually access the app? Then in the app, what's the actual data that we need, right? This table, this spreadsheet gives us the clue, right? But right now, all the data here is kind of entangled. We have essentially one table here of technicians, where what we want to do is we want to split out all of the unique sort of types of data that we have. So we have an actual data model that we can build a piece of software. What can each role see and do? So what are the pages? What's the user experience in this app, right? We kind of need to understand what's the data model first, and then we can start to kind of design a view, a window onto that data, not just for reading it, but for manipulating it, for changing that data. This is just one big view where you read and write data into the same place. In software, we don't have to have that restriction. What automated workflows do we need? So if this happens, right, then this happens. So there's this spreadsheet is just showing a snapshot in time of, data goes in and you read data back out. But of course, with software, you can have processes that are running in the background, maybe running on a schedule. So for example, notifications when certain credentials are about to expire. And then, once you've got that all figured out, you can start to dream a little and think, what are ways in which we can actually make this piece of software even more efficient? And that might be, right, implementing AI in intelligent places. That might be connecting to other tools that you're using as a business. And you sort of, in a way, this spreadsheet, even though it might start as just being converted to a piece of software that these departments are using in direct replacement to the spreadsheet, over time it can almost cannibalize, that's probably the wrong word, but it can start to sort of eat these other processes and other tools in your business and unify them, so that you're not relying on third-party vendors anymore for other pieces of software or systems in your business, and all of the data lives in one place. So you can your dispatching tool can talk to your, in a way, your sort of technician database, right? Your like ERP system. So we'll go through these questions here sort of one by one in a little bit more detail, just for this particular example, this particular use case, just to kind of try to flesh it out a little bit. So we already talked about the roles that we need here, right? Our dispatchers, our sort of HR, who the head of our HR in this hypothetical example is someone called Dana. The next one is, what's the actual data? And I'm not talking here about like the content of these rows. I'm talking about the structure, right? Any piece of software, even this spreadsheet, even though it's not showing it that authentically, right, is built upon a particular data model, a structure. So that's particular sort of different concepts that are related with one another. So the first obvious sort of concept or object in our world is the technician, right? So each row here is a unique technician. But we also have, right, this field called a home location, which is already built into the spreadsheet. So like a home branch that the dispatchers can use to help quickly find people who can go out to certain sites, right, depending on where they live. And somebody had the foresight to sort of build that into another place within the app. So they're already thinking here in terms of a data model, right? This is one type of entity that we could actually link to a technician, right? It's not the same thing as a technician. It's another entity that is linked to a technician. But then what we also have here is, conceptually at least, are these different sites, these different locations that these technicians get dispatched out to. But this is not a concept that actually explicitly exists in the spreadsheet right now. It's implicit because you have, Ohio Health, UC Med, right? It's implicit, but this is actually a concept that it more lives in the dispatcher's sort of world. They might be using other tools to actually manage the scheduling and dispatching of these technicians. So what we want to do is we want to kind of untangle this, and we want to treat it as a first-class citizen, if you will, as its own entity that we can link to the other entities that make up the system. And then finally, we have this thing called a credential, which again is implicit, right? These are all right now treated as properties of a technician. They're just other columns within this table of technicians, but they really do deserve to be their own thing. And one of the big clues here is that you have things, you have like an aerial lift number, right? That's aerial lift is clearly one credential, and the aerial lift expiry is another column. So you've got two columns that are kind of pointing at the same thing, which is this aerial lift credential, and that aerial lift credential is just encoded within a particular technician's row, and it doesn't actually need to be. So once we've got your head around what the data model actually looks like, then we can start to kind of think about how we map the workflows that these different departments are using and the data that they need to manipulate into an actual user experience. And this is not necessarily like a quick sort of one and done, this is obvious, right? This is a process of sort of mapping out those workflows and thinking through what's the ideal user experience. But we don't need to kind of reinvent the wheel a lot of the times. It's just a matter of kind of having the data model almost shake out and tell us what the interface should be. So the obvious one is a technician's view, which is very similar to what we have here, right? Now this is a view that all three sort of departments, if you will, or all three roles that we've talked about want to access and need to access. So what anyone here in this view can do is, of course, do things that you would expect on a table of data, filter technicians by their name, by their home branch, even by the credential that they have. So we're kind of thinking ahead here. We've got this data model where we know that we're linking a technician with a credential, which means that we'd be able to filter these technicians by credentials that they have. And also with any of these technicians, we can click into them and then view the details for that technician and view the credentials that we're now assuming that we're actually linking to them, right? This is not just encoded on their file, right? This is like a separate, this credential is a separate thing that we're associating with this technician, right? So this is a view that everybody should have, but the dispatchers don't necessarily need to have all of the same permissions. So the dispatchers, right, shouldn't really have the ability to edit technician information. They just view technician information. But we might say that HR and sort of Karen as this super admin, they can do anything. They can edit those technicians at will. Okay, and so here we have a view there where we have those buttons back, and Dana or Karen can have a little pop-up where they can add a new technician and add some of the data that we're just going to port over from the spreadsheet that we know that we have. And notice here that there's an opportunity to add additional structured data, like, hey, is this technician an apprentice or not, which was otherwise just not handled properly. So the idea of somebody being an apprentice was just a note, okay, right? You know, the rule here that, hey, you must pair them with some other type of technician in order for them to be dispatched, right? That no longer needs to be a note anymore, right? That could be encoded as a business rule. If somebody is an apprentice, then we can just flag them very clearly within the interface as an apprentice so that the dispatchers know that they need to pair this person with somebody else. Now, this is also the place where those credentials can actually be created as, again, a first-class citizen, a thing that can actually be added to the file, if you will, of each of these technicians. So there's a list of credentials that's attached to each technician in the system. Okay, so far, so good. What we also want is for Dana, to some extent Karen as well, to be able to view, hey, like what credentials are expiring soon, right? This is one of the core functions that HR needs to be able to do, is to be able to proactively make sure that the technicians within the system are having their credentials updated before they expire. So there's a particular view that we can create. It's the same underlying data, but now we just have this custom view that it wasn't impossible with a spreadsheet. It's just fiddly, a little ugly, just a little hard to maintain. And next, we have basically the super admin functionality. So Karen here has sort of an admin area where she can define that sort of master list of some of these data types, as we're calling them. So for example, the different types of credentials that exist in the system, fairly static information. You just need somebody to be in charge of maintaining it, right? The customers that Meridian services, also not something that necessarily changes that often, but something that can be added to the app. And this is where, like, once you start going through this design process, you'll realize quite quickly that there are these big opportunities to win that were otherwise a little hidden or hard to do with spreadsheets. So for each of these customers, like Mercy Health, right, they've got their own file, and now you can add a requirement for this customer for the credentials that are required for any technician that gets dispatched out there, right? So here's all the requirements that any technician being dispatched to Mercy Health needs to have. And right before, this information wasn't living in the spreadsheet. It was a set of business rules that was divorced from the data store, if you will, of all of the credentials. But now we actually have this opportunity to bring everything together. And what that means is that now the technicians have this really powerful tool where they don't have to now just sort of spot check and see, okay, yeah, which credentials do people have? And they just know in their heads which credentials a technician needs to go to the Mercy Health campus, right? Now they can just choose the customer directly here, and the list will just automatically be filtered to show those technicians that are able to be dispatched there, right? So you're taking away loads of cognitive work, of time that they have to do spot checking. You're taking away the likelihood that they'll make a mistake in this process, right? And this is a very easy thing to do once we have this concept of customers being their own table with their own properties and being able to be linked to other tables like credentials. And then, of course, once we start having a system like this, there becomes other sort of obvious standard things that you'd want to have, like the ability for Karen here to manage kind of across the company, right, which users actually are allowed to have access here, and what's their role, because their role determines what they can actually access in the system. Also, now because we have complete control over this entire system, we can log any change that happens to a technician's file, and we can expose that in an audit log just in case we need to go back in time and figure out sort of how did this mistake happen, right? How did this credential get assigned to this technician even though they never became accredited, right? In case they never got their boiler license, etc. Okay, so once you've got this idea of what each role can see, so essentially what's the sort of the core user experience of this application, then you can start to think about what are the things that happen that we can't see, right? That aren't so obvious. So this is where the automated workflows comes into effect. So in this case, right, we might think about the obvious one that we mentioned a few times, like, hey, let's send some notifications to HR when a credential is close to expiring, right? That could be a credential that is sent to them over email, just where they work, right? Where they're most likely to see that. But there's other really common types of workflows too, like approval workflows, right? The dispatchers, right? They're working with these customers all the time. They might become aware in their daily work or through the shared email box that, from next semester, UC Med requires everybody to have a first aid certificate who's on site, right? Something like that. So rather than them then having to go to Karen to add that in, right? We could just expose some place within the software where a technician can add a new credential directly onto a customer, just in the same way that Karen was, right? Just adding a new requirement here. The only difference is that because this is sort of important information that affects the operations more broadly, is that maybe we want to hide that behind an approval queue before that change actually becomes live and embedded in the logic of the application. So we could just expose a place here where Karen can view those approval requests. And you can imagine here this being an aggregated list of all kinds of things that need to be approved. Now, by going through just this process, right, you will already have something that you're going to feel pretty good and pretty excited about. And you should get that out into the wild. You should deploy that. You should get people using it and start getting reps through that piece of software, ironing out the kinks. But naturally, you're going to want to start to think about what comes next, because now you have a tool that it's not just a stopgap, right? It's not just, you're not just wedging the door open. You actually have something that can evolve and become a broader part of your company operations. So some of the things that you might want to think about are, how do we make this more efficient? So right now we are having HR come in here and add new credentials for each technician, and they're filling out some of these details. And you can imagine this being a really long form, right, for whatever kind of resource that you're managing. If there's a document associated with it that actually already has all of this information, like the license number and the expiry on it, right, we can very easily these days just extract all of that information from the upload of that document, right, from the PDF or image upload. So the first step in this process could be to upload the document, and then we use AI to extract all of the data, and we populate this form as sort of a starting point that then the HR person can approve. And you can imagine going one step further here, like, why is HR inputting all this information? We could give each technician their own login to the system, and then they are just going to add new credentials, update their credentials themselves, and perhaps they just go through a simple approval queue with HR as well before those changes come into effect. That takes a huge load off of HR's plate, and those technicians can get notified directly when their credentials are due to expire. So that's just one example. Another one, again, AI facilitated, is that it might be, you might have dispatchers or whatever the type of role is in your business that are on the road quite often, right? They're working from their phones. You don't always want them to have to boot up an application on their laptop in order to do stuff. So these days, via a technology that's called MCP, we can allow our employees via their ChatGPT or Claude apps on their phone to actually access our database directly through that AI chat. So they could literally ask, hey, we need somebody to go out to UC Med next week. what are our best options? And you can imagine this being obviously a lot more powerful once you start to plug in scheduling and availability data into here as well, which is why sort of the third thing to think about here is like, how do you connect this small piece of software that we've created into the other systems that we're using to manage our business? So, there's simple things like reducing copy and paste, like when a technician, it completes their onboarding and is embedded within the payroll system, we just automatically pick that up via something that we call a webhook, and we create a new record in this new dispatching piece of software, right? But of course, probably the most powerful use case for this is whatever dispatching system that is being used, if it has an API, right, a system that's being used to schedule different technicians out on different locations, is that we can pull that information into our app in order to determine who is available on particular days. Now, some of these systems, they don't always make it easy for you to integrate with, in which case you've got some question marks over like how much of in this case, the dispatching system, can we actually bring into this piece of software, right? We can now naturally sort of extend our software, our custom piece of software, to take over these other operational parts of the business. And so in the past, this is something that would just take, a huge amount of time to develop. Whereas nowadays, right, we've got to do some work to sort of design the system and figure out technically how we're going to hook different pieces together. But then the development process after that is often fairly straightforward, and we want to build things in an iterative way anyway. So, I don't mean to insult your spreadsheet here, but, anybody who's been using a spreadsheet like this will feel the friction and the weight that is put upon using a spreadsheet like this for core operational processes. I think the case for building custom software has never been more compelling. So I encourage you to go through this kind of thought process, just get the wheels kind of turning, right? You don't have to build this huge company operating system from day one. You can take one core sort of operational process like this, where multiple roles are involved, right? And you can just have this piece of software take the work that spreadsheet is doing. And then from there, right, I'd be very surprised if you weren't already getting very excited about how that piece of software could evolve to take over and improve other sort of operational parts of your business. And if you're interested in some of the AI aspects of how software like this would work, I encourage you to check out this video up over here. Thanks.